I'm Gail Fawcett. I'm actually with Employment and Social Development Canada, and I'm a researcher in the area of disability, and I'm going to be presenting today with Stuart, who is my sort of equivalent over at Statistics Canada, and we collaborate on a lot of research together. And today we're going to be talking about our sort of recent research that was just published by Statistics Canada on Tuesday, December 3rd, and it's up on StatCan's website. If you haven't seen it, try to look for the daily on Statistics Canada's website, and it'll take you to it. So, and that's the for us sort of the culmination of months and months of working together. So, anyway, and it's using the 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability, and using some new content on the dynamics of disability. And just to sort of let you know, the two new questions that were added to look at this, we started working on them back in 2014. So that's, in order to fill a data gap, you need a lot of lead time. And so the design, the testing, and eventually fielding of the survey, and now we've got the data. So, and about anyway, so this is actually the first presentation of this particular project. So, yesterday I was in the session on unconscious bias, and so I brought PowerPoint, but I'm going to skip most of it, as I usually do, and confuse everybody. So I'm just gonna go off script here. But and I'm doing that because yesterday the session on unconscious bias made a big impression on me, and I think that would have been a great segue into this research. Tammy Yates, who's down there, she spoke yesterday about that traditional stereotype of disability as something that's constant, not non-changing and permanent, and that there was that was people with disabilities, and then there were people without disabilities. And she talked about the space in between, and really what we're talking about is that space in between, because it's a lot bigger, I think, than a lot of people realize. Maybe not the people in this room, but I think a lot of people don't realize that space exists, how big it is, and how complicated it is. And so that's sort of where we're headed with this. So we've known for about 30 years, there's been a lot of research on people who are in that in-between space. And it's been called all kinds of different things, but most recently, I think most people will recognize it as episodic disabilities. And that sort of culminated last year in a private member's bill in Parliament, and that led to a HUMA, and a report came out in March, and a lot of people in this room, actually this time last year, were running off to testify. But we've been working on this for quite some time, and we're going to give you a bit of an idea as to what that space in between looks like. And also, what we're doing here today is providing you that kind of profile. What does it look like? How many are there? Sort of what are the issues? But there's a lot of other work going on out there, and I would mention another project called ACED, and it stands for Accommodating and Communicating About Episodic Disabilities, and it's a large multi-year project that's going on with a number of people in this room, and they're looking at the sort of very real practical tools for dealing with this space in between. And so this is to support that type of work, and that's how, I think, getting back to what Emil said, how it really takes us all working together to kind of move this thing forward. So we ended up, I won't get into a lot of the details, but using two little questions, which was all we had space for, and it was a big challenge, and we learned a lot in the testing. We came up with 4 groups. So these are the groups that we ended up with. You can use those questions to come up, you can reconfigure them in ways for different purposes. For our purpose, we were very focused on employment, and these 4 groups operated a bit differently. So I'm just going to give you a very quick kind of overview. So you'll see continuous, that's our traditional stereotype. Okay. Oh, that's our traditional stereotype. And is that 5 minutes for the two of us? Oh, sorry. Okay, so that's our traditional stereotype. Then there's progressive. sorry. So then there's progressive, and those are for people whose limitations are worsening over time. They may have some type of dynamic, but the big thing for them is that the limitation is increasing over time. Then we have recurrent, and those are people who can have up to a month, not always have a month, but they can have up to a month where they don't have any limitation. And that's sort of that on again, off again pattern where it's easy to look like you don't have a disability. Then there's fluctuating, and those are people, they never get as much as a month without feeling limited, but they do have fluctuations, and it's kind of going all over the place. And so those last three were the three dynamic groups. Okay, so of our 6.2 million adults with disabilities from the 2017 CSD, you can see that 61% actually experience some level of dynamics. So that's the space in between. That's how big that space in between is. It's the majority of people with disabilities don't have that nice, neat stereotype upon which our biases are based, our assumptions about people with disability and our programs and policies and eligibility requirements are based upon that stereotype. But that stereotype applies to the 2.4 million that comprise less than 40% of the population with disabilities. So it's a lot bigger, and I don't think I really need to convince anybody in this room, but this is a wider message maybe for sort of changing attitudes in society. And people can move from one category to the other across the life course. These are not static groups. You can find people in every group with the same underlying condition. They can, across their life course, they might be found in all different groups. So just to give you a quick overview of the sort of what it looks like, age, recurrent disabilities are more common among younger people. Progressive disabilities start to take over for older age groups. On the basis of gender, women are more likely to experience fluctuating limitations than men. Men are more likely to experience continuous, the traditional stereotype. And one quick thing I'd like to point out is that among youth, men are much more likely than women to experience continuous disabilities, and women are more likely than men to experience both recurrent and fluctuating. So for young adults, really there is a big gender thing. So I'm going to hand it over.
Okay.
Sorry, we need more time.
That's okay. So we're going to be doing slide on employment and workplace accommodations. How much time do I have? I've got 2.
No,
okay.
I'm so sorry.
This is going to be very high level. So clearly, persons with disabilities need work, and they need the supports to be able to do that work. This can be particularly challenging for those who have some type of disability dynamic. So if you can imagine, if you've got a disability that is not constant, that it's changing either in intensity or changing in frequency, that's going to create a challenge to you as the employee and to the employer who's trying to provide you supports. I'll raise my hand. Next slide. Okay. So what this table is showing you is clearly what we're seeing is that when you just look at persons with disabilities overall, you get one message. But as soon as you break down that group into different disability dynamic, you start to see changes in the employment rate. The persons who with recurrent have the highest employment rates. Persons with progressive have the lowest. Okay, next slide. So in terms of what we're talking about is persons who are employed between the ages of 25 to 64. So what we see is that when we look at employment experiences, those with progressive or fluctuating limitations share somewhat similar experiences than those with recurrent or continuous. So what we start to see in the employment profile is that there's actually a grouping where you see the progressive and the fluctuating share similar characteristics versus the continuous and the recurrent groups. And so what we do find is that that impact has more of an effect on persons with progressive and fluctuating. Next slide. Okay. I'm not going to go into this slide because I only have a minute, and it's actually one of the most complicated concepts to talk about. However, I am here all day for anybody who wants to talk to me about it afterwards. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what we're looking at here is requirements for workplace accommodations. And what we see is that, once again, when we look at the progressive and the fluctuating, about half of that employee population require at least one type of accommodation in the workplace. If you look at those with recurrent or continuous, it's about a third. What we find is, in all cases, the highest requirements tend to be around flexible work arrangement. The lowest requirements tend to be around human and technical supports. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly, let me just explain what we're talking about with level of need. I actually had to create a somewhat sophisticated calculation to get this what looks like a very simple chart. And basically, the idea is that if the person required at least one accommodation in the workplace, did he or she get it? So if a person required 3 and they only got 2, they had some needs met. If they required 3 and they got 3, they had all needs met. If they required 3 and they got nothing, they had no needs met, to give you an idea of what it looks like. So what we find is that for flexible work arrangements, in terms of statistical significance testing, we don't see differences between the groups. So we can we can talk about it collectively as a whole, which is, on average, as a whole, about 70% of persons have all their needs met, 8% have some, and around 22% have none of their needs met. Once again, this is a very major paper. The paper itself is over 30 pages long, so quite a bit of analysis, and hopefully there'll be another time when we can go about it in more detail. So I'll stop. Thank you.